Hi, listen to this sentence. Ye who listen with credulity to the whispers of fancy, and pursue with eagerness the phantoms of hope, who expect that age will perform the promises of youth, and that the deficiencies of the present day will be supplied by the morrow, attend to the history of Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. Wow. Right off the bat, Samuel Johnson shows us two things. He's a heck of a good writer, and he's a bummer. He's a downer. He is a pessimist, although like most pessimists, he would just call himself a realist, right? Oh my goodness. Sam Johnson is a great character, along with James Boswell, his companion, to finish the semester. He's born 1709, dies in 1784, which is just about perfect, for the end of our semester and the beginning of the 216 course next semester, right around the age of revolution. Boswell is a much younger man, born much later, 1740, although he doesn't live a long life, he wasn't really a good liver, right? Sam Johnson is the patron saint of Grub Street. You may remember I talked about Grub Street in a previous video. Grub Street represents the pulp fiction market, right? The penny novels, the junk that just flies out there, the kind of stuff you can buy in airports, read on the airport and leave on the airport, right? The Danielle Steeles and Tom Clancy's of the world. Sorry if I've stepped on anybody's toes here. But that's what he was. He was a pulp fiction writer, basically. And Sam Johnson, well, the story goes that Sam Johnson wrote Rasselas because he needed money to pay for his mom's funeral, her expenses. Bam, just put it out there, just in a very short period of time, okay? Because he needed the money. And as I said, I think in the previous video also, he famously stopped writing once he received a pension from the crown. That is to say, he had money he was getting just for being Sam Johnson. And he stopped writing. And the quote was, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote, except for money." And since he didn't need any money, he stopped writing. Luckily for us, his good pal, James Boswell, accompanied Sam Johnson in that latter part of his life, taking copious notes of what was being said at the innumerable dinner parties that Sam Johnson went to, and James Boswell went to with him. And from that sprang the biography called The Life of Johnson, one of the most popular books in the English canon for a long, long time. Indeed, some people call this the Age of Johnson, in many ways because of what Boswell wrote, kind of putting Sam Johnson as a towering figure of really the middle of the 18th century, right? Ending only with, as I've talked about, the Age of Revolution. Rasselas is a satire, right? And we've read a number of satires in this class this semester, right? On the one hand, he's kind of playing with the Siddhartha story, right? Out in the East, right? A young prince who's lived in this very protected environment, isn't allowed to experience pain and suffering, and thus knows very little about the world, but is curious, and he works his way to get out into the world. And this is the story of Rasselas, right? But, notice how Johnson is presenting this. It is, as I said, a satire, and there's a lot of humor in it. For instance, how Rassless resolves not to waste time and spends months in his resolve not to waste time. Right? It takes him a long time to get out of that place. Rassless realizes there's more to life than what he experiences. He knows this because other people come in from the outside. And in particular, there's one teacher, Imlach. But before he has Imlach, he has other teachers. And one is particularly close to my heart for a particular reason. Let me just show you this. It's not really showing up. Maybe if I put it closer to my own face. There we go. Nothing will ever be attempted if all possible objections must be first overcome. Samuel Johnson. Believe it or not, and since this is an online class, most of you probably never met me in real life. Some people have found me to be a tad pessimistic. That sometimes I can be kind of a downer. And one of those people is my dad. And I don't know, I was having some conversation on the phone with my father one time, and I was explaining to him why one of his ideas wasn't going to work. And he sent this thing to me in the mail, right? This is my dad trying to tell me something, right? Nothing will ever be attempted if all possible objections must be first overcome. Until I read Rassless. I think I'd actually read it before I got this, but I certainly didn't remember the line. But when I read Rassless, and particularly chapter 6, on the art of flying, a dissertation on the art of flying, and the inventor is trying to tell Rassless that he's going to invent a way that he can fly out of where he is and get out into the real world. And Rassless keeps on saying, but what about this? But what about this? But what about this? And then that's when the inventor says those lines. Nothing will ever be attempted. And so I saw that. I recognized it. And then when the inventor falls into the water, I actually felt pretty vindicated, let me tell you that. I'd had this thing up on my office wall for years. Took it down the next day. I was right. Because that inventor fell into the water. He didn't pay attention to the objections. Rassless comes out in 1759. That is also the same year, by the way, that a man named Voltaire in France published a book called Candide. Now, Candide is actually in some ways kind of similar to Rassless, both the story and the character. In Voltaire, the line is, "We live in the best of all possible worlds." And this should remind you of Alexander Pope. Whatever is right. Remember that line from Essay on Man. In Candide, horrible things happen over and over. And this character named Pangloss keeps repeating this. We live in the best of all possible worlds. This is a critique of Enlightenment thinking. The idea that things are getting better all the time. Reason and rationality and science are moving us forward. This is very pre-Freud, obviously. People are given the right information, the right knowledge, all things are going to happen. In Rassless, the expression is the choice of life. In other words, you can choose your life choices, right? You can choose what you do. And so all you have to do is make the right choices and everything will be hunky-dory. See the homeless on the streets? Did they make the right choice? Well, one of the things that Johnson would point out, one of the things that the story of Rasselas points out, you don't always have right choices. Sometimes you have choices, but they're always bounded, right? In other words, choices, well, you may say you have choices, but they might not be good choices. And everybody's choices are bound in some way by circumstance. Even if you're wealthy, young, healthy, you got 1 million followers on Instagram or Twitter or what have you, you're still bounded, right? You're still bounded. Now, the story in Rasselas is fairly what I would call episodic. Kind of like an old-fashioned TV sitcom, where you have a set of characters who are pretty much what we might call flat characters. They don't change very much over time. And we just kind of move them around in different situations, and it's situation comedy. So we have Rasselas, right? We have Imlach. We have his sister, who shows up like completely out of the blue, by the way. Absolutely no foreshadowing of that whatsoever. And the princess's servant. You notice how also, after all this time in the Happy Valley, when nobody can find their way out, they suddenly find their way out. Right? Again, kind of like a bad TV show. But Imlach and Rasselas and Nakiah, the sister and her servant, they get out in the real world, right? And the problem is, Rasselas starts looking at all these different choices. There's a choice to be boisterous and party with the young men. He points out the folly of doing that. They laugh at him. It's a great scene. He goes to a teacher to teach him about the best way to live, and he talks about not being overwhelmed with emotion like a Stoic. Only that person loses his daughter and is terribly upset. Is it better to be rich? Is it better to be poor? Is it better to be a shepherd? Is it better to be one of the wealthiest people in the kingdom, one of the most powerful people in the kingdom? Nobody's really happy, right? As Rasselas goes around in the real world, he finds everybody has something which is making them unhappy. There is no single direction that he can find that will assure happiness, right? Nothing. Is it better to be single? Is it better to be married? Are the women happier than the men? All the answers are no. It's like freaking nobody's happy. Love the passage, and this is where we end our reading, right? Is where they go to the Great Pyramids. And the servant, her name is Pekua, is afraid of ghosts, right? And so she won't go into the pyramid because she's seen the Mummy movie. And so they leave her outside, or they go inside, only to have her kidnapped because she was outside on her own. Don't worry, if you don't read the whole story of Rasselas, I can tell you she comes back. She's fine. She'll be okay. The thing about Rasselas, especially if I think about it in comparison to Voltaire's Candide, Candide is vicious. I mean, the story is vicious. Voltaire is very vicious with his characters. He kills people left and right in these stories. Johnson, you can see there's a much more tender, kinder touch, even as he's showing the fallacy of optimism. Even